welcome back to my channel, and welcome back to another episode of Tech Girl Thursdays, where I have a conversation with a different woman in tech every single Thursday. Today I am here with Tina, and she is going to be sharing her experience in the tech and data science world. So yeah, thank you so much, Tina, for joining me on this Zoom call. Just to start off, can you introduce yourself, your background, hobbies, interests, also about your YouTube channel too?
Yeah, for sure. So thanks again for having me. So currently I'm working as a data scientist at a unknown company, part of FAANG. Um, and I've been here for just a few months, so I'm still pretty new. And before that, I did my master's degree in computer science from the University of Pennsylvania. During my master's degree, I interned at Goldman Sachs, also doing data science. Although I did go through the software engineering recruiting stuff and all the interviews as well. And then previous to that, I worked in research and bioinformatics, and my undergraduate was actually in pharmacology, so I was pre-med. What about my hobbies? What do I like to do? I like to do YouTube. That is pretty much like taking over all of my free time. So yeah, like my channel is focused on data science as well as a touch of software engineering, because I've also had experience in that area, a lot on just recruiting and how to do things smartly. So how to minimize effort and maximize your outcome in achieving your goals. That's like kind of my life's model as well.
How did you first get into the data science space? So it sounds like you started off with pharmacology, pre-med. So how did you transition into data science?
Long story short, I was pre-med. Finally realized I would be a very bad doctor. Decided to not put my future patients through that. Didn't know what to do with my life. So I ended up doing bioinformatics research, because I was actually also really bad at doing wet lab research, because I was really bad with my hands in general. So I was like, oh, what can I do? So I went into bioinformatics research. And that's where I taught myself R at that time while working. And then that's really where data science came to play, because bioinformatics is essentially a specialized form of data science. And then from there, I realized that having a computer science background would actually make me a much better data scientist. And that's why I did my master's. So throughout, I was definitely, I don't want to say like, I definitely knew I was going to do data science, because I didn't. I also thought I was going to do software engineering, which is why I, did interviews as well. But I always leaned much more heavily into data science.
I guess, like, how was the transition from a very non-technical field to this technical field? What, like, work, maybe classes did you have to take?
So during my undergrad, I didn't really touch computer science. I technically took a couple courses, but one of them, it was like really, really intro, and I, just was like, oh, this is a for loop, whatever, and then I forgot. And then the second class, I pretty much like didn't show up to class. Don't be like me, but I pretty much didn't show up to class. I somehow managed to pass that course and took it pass fail, so I don't really even count that as experience. So pretty much I actually got serious about learning how to code and do things at my job. For some reason, my principal investigator, the professor, took me on. I somehow tricked him into taking me on, even though I didn't really know how to do anything, including how to code. So I think it was mostly that, like, the job forced me to learn how to code, because if I didn't know how to code, then how was I supposed to do my job? So that transition was actually pretty rough. So I just wasn't used to it. I think the biggest thing was like, I'm not a very patient person. So if it doesn't work the first time, I would be like, freak out. But then slowly as time goes on, I lowered my expectations. And when things actually do work, then I get very excited, because my default is that they don't work. So yeah, like over time, I learned that. And then finally transitioning to my master's in computer science, that was rough. That was really rough. I failed my first ever midterm, which is the first midterm I ever took. And then it was just like a pretty hard time doing that transition. But I think for me, I had that motivation to do it, because I knew that I wanted to get more technical.
I feel like a lot of people I've talked to have failed their first midterm, or like when they first write code, it never works the first time. And I feel like that's definitely a skill that needs to be developed, and like failure is completely okay, which is something that needs to be like gotten over when learning about coding. The default, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
then I get very suspicious. You know, I'm just like, hmm.
Yeah. Something's wrong if it's right. Like,
Right?
so as a FANG data scientist, what does your day-to-day look like?
It kind of varies because it depends on like what I'm working on. I feel like a lot of times people think data scientists just like, I don't know, like do models or something, but it really actually depends more on what the problem actually is. And a lot of your time is actually spent on defining what the problem is before you can go solve it. Um, yeah, so like depending on like what it is, some days I could be like, you know, just in meetings. Other days I could be mostly like coding and just doing the modeling work. And also the tools that I use vary a lot as well. So the general rule of thumb is always do it the simplest way possible. So if you can just do a SQL query, then you know don't go and do a fancy model or some deep learning thing because nobody really cares what you do. It's really like the result of it that matters a lot more. Um, so yeah.
What would you say is your favorite part about being a data scientist?
What is my favorite part? I get really excited when I discover things. So it's kind of like, you know, when I'm actually doing an analysis or trying to figure out something, I'm like, oh my God, dear God, I don't want to do this. This you know, it's like, why did I choose this career? This is, but then like the excitement comes from, you know, after you worked on something for a while, and then it's like that last click that you have to do to run your code to see like what the thing actually is resulting in. That's what gets me. That's what gets me every time. That's actually one of the things I also like feel like really drew me towards data science and not software engineering, which is actually something I also made a video about because I was like trying to choose between them. So I don't really get excited when I'm building something. To me, it's like, oh, like, you know, this is, I already know this thing is gonna like look exactly like this. But with data science, is the fact that I don't know, that's what really gets me.
That's so true too. Just there's so much data out there that's hasn't been explored yet. So it's like diving into the unknown and trying to figure out different insights from it.
Yeah, for sure. That's also why I think the word science, data scientist, is really important because you actually are a scientist as opposed to an engineer. In this case, so I'm actually surprised not more scientists transition into data
So,
science.
okay, I asked you what your favorite part was. What is kind of like your least favorite part or the hardest part about being a data scientist?
Ah, I think it's the imposter syndrome, to be honest. Just whenever I feel like I'm like, oh, you know, I'm doing good, and then something happens, and I realize that I actually don't know anything, or like, you know, a fundamental assumption that I had was incorrect. You know, that's really the thing that is like difficult. So it's, I feel there's also a distinct you have to distinguish between like learning stuff versus like the imposter syndrome, because I don't have a problem with learning things. I like learning new things and I love seeing new things being developed. But it's the fact that sometimes, you know, I think I'm like doing good and things are like, you know, going well, and then suddenly I just realized that the way that I'm approaching analysis, for example, where like, you know, something that I just like assumed that was correct was like completely wrong. And then I just go like, oh man, but I've been like using this for a while now. What other like problems did I have that, you know, I didn't that I did wrong in the past? That's also a thing that keeps me up at night, really, because I'm like, how do I know my analysis is right? How do I know it's not because it did an error? Because with software engineering coding, you know, the compiler, whatever, it tells you have an error. But with data science, you don't know if you have an error.
So, you made a an interesting point about like learning versus imposter syndrome. So, how do you, I guess, like differentiate between the two?
I approach learning as like as kind of without cockiness as possible, if you want to call it that. Let's just say that going through my master's degree and just like, you know, failing a lot of times in general has lowered my ego. So I don't really have that much of an ego anymore. So I don't have an issue like admitting that I don't know something. So it also makes learning a lot more exciting because it's about the thing that you're learning instead. And yeah, so that's something that I don't really have like that big of a problem with now. I also try to spend at least like an hour a day learning something. That's something that I always like incorporate into my day when possible, because it's really important to do that in this field. Now with imposter syndrome, I define it maybe a little bit differently. It's more the fact when you think you know something but then you actually don't know something, that's when like the imposter syndrome for me like really gets to me. I don't have as much of a problem being in a room full of people just like feeling I don't know anything, because I kind of already accepted that I don't know anything, if that makes any sense.
How do you deal with imposter syndrome?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I have like massive amounts of imposter syndrome. And I've always just been like the kind of person that's like, oh man, like, I don't belong here. I always just feel like, I don't know anything. I don't belong there in general. So what I've really done to get over that might not be the best solution. I still have like massive amounts of imposter syndrome all the time. But what I do is I just don't care and I do it anyway. So when I feel like I can't do something, like for example, like applying to a job, right? Like or like, just like networking with people or just talking to people, I'm like, oh God, I don't belong here, whatever, I'm just gonna do it anyway. So I just like kind of got myself to that point. So I guess like it doesn't affect me as much in terms of my behavior.
For what it's worth, like you are killing it with the job, the YouTube, and all of your videos and giving advice and everything. So kind of moving back to your job. So what type of like tools and skills do you, I guess, like use the most, or do you need in general?
Generally, SQL, master SQL. Like, people are like, oh, SQL is irrelevant because we have no SQL. No, you have no SQL, but you also still have SQL. And it's just like the default to things, because doing a SQL query is just so fast in terms of like optimization. And it's just like when you have larger databases and things, it's just the best way and fastest way of doing something. So I always tell people, first thing you should do is go and master SQL. And for your interviews and stuff, almost every single data science interview is gonna just harp on the SQL portion of it a lot. So that's something that's really, really important to do. And then for the other stuff, kind of like increasing in complexity, right? So after you do SQL, you're like, oh, like maybe I have to do something more complex. Then you get your Python out, and then you do pandas, you do like data frame manipulations. You also start doing models with sklearn. So you can get more and more complex, and you can be like, oh, let me like go make a custom deep learning thing for something. But I don't think that's really necessary in almost like most cases. SQL will solve most of the problems that you're facing, and just figuring out how to use the sklearn packages and things like that is going to solve pretty much your other half. Also, there's like auto ML now. So like, that part, ML is very much getting automated. So in addition to these technical tools, I actually highly suggest people concentrate on actually figuring out the question first. So looking at like, how do you define a data question? Like, what are the questions you should be even asking? What's your hypothesis? How to test your hypothesis? And that's a part that people don't really focus on that much, and it's important because it's also reflected in the interview. They ask you all these kind of questions in the interview as well, because it's very, very relevant to your job.
Following up from that, what resources do you recommend to, I guess, like get better at SQL or sklearn, or even just practicing asking questions and hypothesis and things?
So just to like emphasize that part even more, you can probably ask any data scientist, ask them, what do you spend most of your time on? It's not on the actual coding data science part. It's on the defining the question and figuring out the hypothesis part. On finding data, that's also very relevant. So yeah, to answer that question, I have like maybe like a little bit of an untraditional approach to this. Kind of fits into my philosophy of minimizing effort, maximizing outcome. Like I basically refuse to put in extra effort for things. So I know that the best way of getting a job if you don't have a job is to get experience as close to a job as possible. So if you're a student, I highly recommend doing a research position, because that gives you the context to learn, and it also gives you all the experience in terms of everything pre-data science, before you start coding, like figuring out your question, looking at the data, how to find the data, right? How do you form a hypothesis? So that's what I highly recommend. Also, if you other ones that I have are like pro bono consulting. I've done that personally. It's also helpful if you're out of school to do that, and also open source projects as well. There's actually a lot of data science open source projects. So I really try to get people to do projects that are as close to real experience as possible, because what's the best way of getting a job? Well, it's by being good at doing your job. right? And how do you be good at doing a job? Well, by doing a job. So we gotta like, it's like kind of circular, but we want to like mimic it as much as possible. And that's really what will give you that skill set.
One of the things that you say in a lot of your videos, and you've mentioned it kind of in the past few minutes too, is your personal motto is to work smarter, not harder. So what does that mean to you, and how do you kind of implement it into your life?
Yeah. So I was also kind of forced into this model in a way because I've always just been like not a great student. Like I can't sit still in class. Like I'm like the kind of person who doesn't show up to class most of the time. And even when I was in high school, I would not show up to class. And, like I just basically like didn't know what was happening most of the time. And if that would be fine if I just didn't care about my grades, when I didn't care about like, doing well in life, getting a job. But unfortunately, I also cared a lot about that. So how could I possibly not show up to class and still do well? Well, you gotta like find the things that are the most important to do, right? So I always minimize my effort, find a thing, like whatever goal it is that I have, do the like things that are going to contribute towards achieving the goal the most. And that's really just been a part of my entire philosophy. Like, for example, if I have like a midterm coming up, right? Oh, I didn't show up to class. Well, I will go and find out what's actually going to be on the midterm, right? Like, I'm not going to like go and cheat, but like I can look at past midterms, for example, right? And I would do that and then find like kind of topics in which I know has been done in the past, therefore it has a high likelihood of showing up in the future as well. And then I'll study those things as opposed to cover everything that the professor has talked about. And then when it comes to like interviewing and stuff, that's pretty much what I did as well. I always do things kind of like the other way around. Like when I was like doing my interviews, well, like, what did I have to know? Well, I had to know SQL. Guess what? I actually didn't know any SQL. So I went and found questions, like actual interview questions that I knew I was going to be asked. And then I practiced those questions specifically. So I was not a master at SQL when I was doing my interviews. I'm still not, but I was a master at doing those interview questions because my goal was to get a job. And yeah, like I guess like even now, that's kind of how I approach everything as well. Like whenever I'm trying to get something done, I just find like what's the most important things I have to do to get this thing done, and I just learn those specific things.
As like a FANG data scientist, and you are a woman in tech, so how has your experience been like, kind of like as a woman navigating like this data science tech space?
It's a good question because it's something that, to be honest, I don't really think about as much, and it might just be because I'm just so used to it that I don't really like recognize it that much anymore, which is a both good and bad thing. Um, okay, so why don't we actually pull that back to? I want to talk about my internship at Goldman Sachs because I like that one is actually more evident. I was one of two women, I believe. Yeah, I was one of two women in the entire team. Um, and the team was like maybe 10, 20 people ish. So there, I think it was a lot more like evident. Oh, also I was the only like Asian person there. So there was like also that. Yeah, like focusing on the woman part, it was more like they're just like jokes and stuff that I just feel like I wasn't really part of. Locker talk, if you want to call it that, as a very famous person has pointed out previously. Yeah, like stuff like that. I just kind of feel a little bit, like, okay, I guess I just won't say anything here. And the other parts would be, one of them that I did think was kind of unfortunate is people are like, oh, it's like not fair for women to get their own events, like race hopper and things like that. And they're like, oh, like how come like there's no events for men? So why should there be for women? And I find myself having to explain like that's because the way that the system is set up, we're trying to rectify some of the biases that are there, right? And they're like, yeah, but how do you know like doing this is like actually balancing it out? And I'm just like, well, you don't, right? You don't know if that it's actually balancing out. When you can quantify that, then things will be so much easier. So I do get into like conversations about this. Sometimes, so most of the time though, I think it's not like too evident, like it's not too overt, which is also one of the things that it's covert, right? A lot of this stuff is like insidious little covert things that is very hard to point out and to actually solve the problem. But I've also found myself kind of kind of reteaching the way that I talk, relearning how to talk really. As a woman, I think I do have tendencies of being like, I think that perhaps, or, being like, maybe this is a stupid question, like, I'm not sure if this is valid, maybe I should stop talking. Like, these kind of phrases were like thoughts in my mind, and I've kind of just identified that consciously and try to eliminate that from both the way that I think as well as the way that I talk. I don't know how well that works out, but I think it's working out.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I've heard so many, oh, why are there like specific female events? And like, oh, why do you get more opportunities to like different jobs? Like, where's the equality in that? And it's just really frustrating to hear because like the whole purpose of it is like for the pipeline and to get more women into the field. And so it's interesting that like we've both had like very similar conversations, and I think it is, I don't know, maybe like an education problem potentially.
Honestly, I don't really know, to be honest, because okay, it definitely is an education problem, but I also feel like it's one of those things that if you're not part of the minority group, in this case women, in a certain field, you just don't really think of it, of like all the different things that are occurring, which means that you can't identify it, and you just think it's unfair advantage to people. So education definitely, but I don't know actually how you would be able to convey that to a guy, like the things that you've experienced firsthand in a way that really they can like really experience for themselves. So not that I'm saying like, all guys like, they can't figure this out, or they don't understand, or they can't experience. So I think it also matters a lot on like males, where like people in general, to listen to what females or other minorities are talking about their experiences and take their word for it. Because I also find a lot of times that they start going like, well, maybe this is not true, and just start like arguing with me about whether it's true or not. And it always comes down to me being like, well, this is what I experienced, right? And I don't have an argument for what I experienced, because that's just what happened.
That's advice that I think all of us can take, just like trust the minority experience and then listening to them
Yeah.
and just trying to understand what their experience is. But like you'll never be able to walk in their shoes, you just kind of have to listen and understand. So yeah, I mean, hopefully like the whole industry and other industries too in general will kind of shift towards that and listen more. But I really like how what you were saying about the language, like trying to cut out certain language in how you speak, because I mean, I've also caught myself doing this, but kind of putting doubt into it to kind of almost like, I don't know. I don't even have to explain it,
Why?
but yeah, exactly. I don't know why I do it, and why like a lot of people do it, a lot of women do it, but yeah, that's something we gotta take out. So definitely going to be following your example for that.
Okay, I'm still just to like say like I'm really still trying here. Like I'm nowhere near where I want to be, and the only thing I can say I'm better at doing is at least like identifying it as a problem and trying to look into it, just be like a little bit more aware of it. And actually another example that I have very personally is, so like with my YouTube channel, because it's a lot on career advice, and like what you have to do to get a job and things like that. So there's like a lot of people who reach out to me going like, hey, like can you like look at my resume, or like can you answer XYZ questions and things. And I try to get to them, but I can't like manage to get through all of them a lot of times. So what I noticed is that there's, first of all, more men will reach out to me, but that might be demographic basis because there's just more men in the field. However, say like I missed the message on LinkedIn or in my email, right? And if it's a guy, they will message me on another platform usually. Like maybe they'll email me and then message me on LinkedIn and leave a YouTube comment, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, and then I would get to it, right? But for a woman, they would message me one time on whatever platform they're choosing. If I don't get to it, I didn't see it, then they just never say anything again. So I thought that was a very interesting because from a data perspective, right? Like eliminating that bias there. So this is like a clear exhibition of behavior. So like these women, they would message me and I assume they're like, oh, this person doesn't want to talk to me and, they just don't care or something. When in reality it's because I just, missed your message when I was like going through them, because I just get so many messages, especially on LinkedIn and email. So that assumption of whatever like is going on in their head just causes them to not try again to reach out to me. Well, for guys, like there's people like messaging me like lots and lots of times, right? Until I respond to them. Sometimes it's a little bit annoying when they ask me like very nebulous questions, but I appreciate the fact that they do, and I do try to answer them when they do that.
That's so interesting. And that kind of reminds me of, like, I think there was some study where they were looking at job applications, and men would apply if they only met like a certain percentage of the requirements, and then women would only apply if they met like all of the requirements. So I don't
Which
know,
is
kind of,
ridiculous.
which is crazy. Yeah. To everyone watching out there, to all the girls and women, follow this example that Tina outlined. Message people again, apply to the jobs, even if you don't 100% meet the requirements. What goals do you have for your career and then also your YouTube channel?
Man, I don't even know what I'm gonna eat tomorrow. So I'm kidding. Yeah. So I do have goals. Okay, let's start with career. So I actually really enjoy what it is that I'm doing. And I bounced around doing like different things. Not a lot, but like definitely a few times. And I feel like this is something that's really like piques my interest. Like I want to actually go to work. It's not like I have to get myself up and go to work. There's just so much learning out there that I know that I can do, and I want to do, and just like the work in general I really enjoy. So for the foreseeable future, I think I will stick with that, and just try to learn, to contribute, to try to be as impactful as possible in that sense. So yeah, that's career wise. In terms of my YouTube channel, to be honest, I'm still kind of exploring, because I haven't actually started for that long. I think it's been like 3 months since I posted my first videos. I'm still exploring on like what it is that I think I want to talk about, what people actually want me to talk about, because those things have to match. I can't just talk about my life, cats, nobody wants to listen. So, I'm still like trying to find where that is and where that's gonna go. So currently I'm pretty focused on like career stuff and just kind of spreading what I think is a good way of approaching how to get a data science job and how to become a better data scientist, things like that. So in the future, I see myself probably going a little bit more nuanced, if that makes sense. So instead of saying do like XYZ to get this job, it might be more like nuanced in terms of like, here are the things that you should consider, or like, focusing on how to like what kinds of skill sets and how to develop these skill sets that are maybe not as like evident and as obvious, as like say SQL, for example. And I'm gonna work out more.
Oh, me too. What advice would you give to anyone who's looking to get into data science, or in general just technology? What advice would you give to them?
You really need to introspect a lot and understand why it is that you're going down a career path that you've decided on going on. And money is really not going to be the answer to that, because if you want money, going to tech is not the best way of getting money. It really isn't. Being a data scientist is not the best way of making money. So you might want to reconsider that. That's your ultimate goal. And it's also it's like a pretty tough route to go through, because it's not like you learn a skill set and then you're like, oh, great, let me just do this for the next 30 years. Like, no, you have to like continuously learn, continuously refresh your skill set. And if that's not something that you enjoy doing, no matter how much money that you're going to be making, you're going to like hate your life. It's going to be miserable. So I really recommend people really introspecting and understanding what they actually value. And that's really hard. I feel like in order to really answer that question, you have to kind of explore your different options, collect your data, if you will, and then try to identify patterns of things that you enjoy doing and things that you don't enjoy doing, and really try to like narrow that down, and to see if that actually matches the career path that you see yourself going to. Yeah, like it's just really worth doing, I think, earlier in your career. Not that like changing your career later is bad or anything, but it's better if you get it right the first time. Yeah, like for example, for me, like figuring out that I liked discovering things as opposed to building things, that was like freaking, I was like mind blown. And this is what I say, it's like, well, like, it's not that interesting. It's like not super mind-blowing, but to me it was like such a big, I was like, oh my god, this is like a huge insight by myself, because that's when I realized I don't enjoy doing engineering work, and I've never enjoyed really doing engineering work. So I can convince myself that I shouldn't be focusing on being a software engineer.
Love that. So make sure to check out Tina's channel. I'll link it in the description below. But she makes really great content about data science, different career tips, and overall, in general, all of her videos are super useful. So go and check it out. But yeah, thank you so much, Tina, for joining me and having this conversation with me.
Thank you so much for having me on, and also leaving me with a lot of other things to think about as well.
And I'll see you all in my next video. Bye.